The gavel slams down with a sharp crack that slices through the silence like a blade, and all eyes turn toward the thin, visibly trembling woman standing beside the plaintiff's table. Her hands folded tightly, knuckles pale as Judge Judy stares down from her towering bench with the kind of derisive smirk that could melt glass, and in a voice dripping with scorn she barks, "So, let me get this straight. You're suing a daycare for unfair termination while you can't even afford to pay your own light bill." And the courtroom titters with laughter. But Janelle Carter doesn't flinch, doesn't respond, just keeps standing there in her worn navy blue blazer, 2 sizes too big and a pair of black flats with fraying seams. Her dark brown eyes wide and defiant, though they shimmer with unshed tears, because she's been humiliated before, far worse than this. And she knows better than to cry in front of a white judge on national television, especially one who's made a living tearing people like her apart. And yet, here she is, a 32-year-old single mother of 3, who wakes up at 4:30 every morning to clean hotel rooms before her second shift, caring for seniors at the nursing home, and then walks another 2 miles to check on her kids at the neighbors before starting her 3rd job at a food truck downtown, her shoulders bent not from shame but from exhaustion, from the weight of everything she carries and everything she hides, like how she still reads textbooks at night on child care development, because she dreams of opening her own center one day, or how she once scored top percentile in her high school finals before dropping out to raise her sister's baby after their mother overdosed and left them with nothing but a grocery list of unpaid bills and shattered promises. And as Judge Judy throws her hands up theatrically and sneers, "What kind of example are you setting for your children suing over a few $100s instead of getting your life together?" The audience murmurs their agreement, and the camera zooms in on Janelle's tight jaw and steady gaze, because they don't see the unpaid overtime, the racist comments she endured at the daycare, the way she was told not to speak too ghetto around the client's children, or how they replaced her with a younger, lighter-skinned woman 2 weeks after Janelle reported safety violations in the infant room. And while the judge continues to mock her income, pulling up her bank statements on the screen and laughing at the $37 balance, Janelle's hands twitch slightly, but she doesn't break, doesn't speak until the moment the back door of the courtroom swings open, and a familiar voice cuts through the spectacle like thunder through glass. "I wouldn't dismiss her so quickly, Judge." And suddenly the room freezes as every head whips around and gasps echo through the air because, walking through the courtroom aisle dressed in a flawless ivory pantsuit with her iconic presence radiating quiet authority, is Oprah Winfrey herself, heels clicking against the floor with every step that seems to shake the room's very foundation. And she doesn't pause, doesn't smile, just walks straight toward Janelle and places a gentle hand on her shoulder before turning to Judge Judy with a voice that could level empires and says, "I've watched you ridicule and belittle people for ratings, but today you forgot one thing. Dignity isn't determined by income." And for the first time, the famously unshakable judge falters her mouth slightly ajar as Oprah continues. "This woman is the reason I started the Carter Foundation initiative. She's one of 100 women in our program who wake up every day and fight for their kids, for their communities, for their future, with nothing but their hands, and their hope and murmurs ripple through the courtroom as Janelle's story floods the monitors behind them. Photos flashing of her volunteering at shelters, helping build free tutoring programs at her church, and even rescuing a child from a burning building last winter while walking home from work. Something the media never covered because it didn't fit the narrative of a low-income black mother. And As Oprah continues speaking, her voice rich with pride, she reveals that Janelle has just been offered a full scholarship to finish her degree in early childhood education, a $50,000 grant to open her own child care center in South L.A., and a mentorship package personally funded by Oprah herself, because when society fails, women like Janelle, we all lose. But when we lift them, we all rise. And Judge Judy, still silent, fumbles with her gavel before finally muttering, "Case dismissed," though her voice is barely audible over the roaring applause rising from the gallery. And as Janelle's knees give out beneath her, Oprah catches her with both arms and whispers, "Stand tall. You were always worthy." And in that moment, Janelle doesn't feel like the woman whose income was mocked on national television. She feels like the hero of her own story, her chin lifting as tears finally fall, not from shame, but from triumph. And as the cameras capture the image of two black women, one rising, one reaching back, standing together in the center of a courtroom that had tried to break one of them, the screen fades to black with a final message echoing in bold white letters. Dignity has no tax bracket, and justice doesn't wear a price tag. The next morning, Janelle wakes to the sound of her prepaid phone vibrating non-stop against the nightstand. The cracked screen lighting up with text messages, missed calls, and unread emails. Some from old classmates she hadn't heard from in years. Others from strangers who watched her stand silently while the world tried to humiliate her and now call her brave, inspirational, a symbol. And as she scrolls, dazed through messages of support from mothers, nurses, single dads, immigrant workers, and even one retired judge who writes, "You reminded me what justice should look like." She can barely process the fact that less than 24 hours ago she stood in front of a camera as just another name in a file. And now she's front page on CNN, trending on Twitter as Janelle Carter deserves. Better, her inbox flooded with media requests, interviews, even a podcast invitation from Michelle Obama's team, but through it all, she holds the phone tightly in one hand while the other smooths the curls of her daughter Ava, who, only 6, wraps her arms around Janelle's waist and says, "Mommy, are you famous now?" And Janelle smiles softly, kneeling to her level eyes, still swollen, but shining now, and replies, "No, baby, I'm not famous. I'm seen." And those words carry a weight she never knew she needed to release until now. Because for so long she existed in the shadows of society beneath minimum wage, beneath respect, beneath notice. And now, not only is she visible, but she is validated, and the transformation begins not with glamour but with quiet power. She meets with Oprah's team at a nonprofit co-working space in Inglewood, where they lay out the roadmap for her childcare center, not as charity, but as legacy. And she names it Dignity House, because she wants every child who walks through those doors to feel what she wasn't allowed to feel. Growing up safe, seen, and celebrated. And as donations pour in from thousands of people across the country, from retired teachers to ex-cons who say they found hope in her story, Janelle begins hiring staff, many of them single parents or formerly incarcerated women, people written off just like she was. And the media circus eventually moves on as it always does. But Janelle's story doesn't end with the headline. It begins with the ripple she created, because in the weeks that follow, a movement starts. Other workers begin to file formal complaints against the same daycare chain that fired her. Lawsuits are launched, state regulators step in, and Judge Judy herself issues a rare public apology on national TV. not just for her comments, but for the systemic attitudes her show has helped normalize. And though some say the apology was staged or PR-driven, Janelle doesn't waste energy dissecting motives, because she's too busy writing grant proposals, hosting parenting workshops, and sitting on panels with women who once whispered to her in line at the food bank, and now speak boldly beside her at universities. And late one evening, as she locks up the front door of Dignity House, she sees a small envelope tucked into the mail slot. No name, just the words. Thank you for not giving up. And inside is a $1 bill and a crayon drawing of a smiling black woman holding a child's hand under a rainbow. And she knows without a doubt that this is the real reward. Not the applause, not the funding, not even Oprah's blessing, but the fact that someone out there, a little girl, a tired mother, a quiet father is watching and believing that maybe, just maybe, this world can still be bent toward justice if someone like Janelle Carter keeps standing, keeps speaking, keeps showing up with her chin lifted and her heart unbroken, proving that no courtroom, no ridicule, and no judge, no matter how powerful, can silence the dignity of a soul that refuses to shrink. Weeks pass, and Janelle Carter's name becomes more than a fleeting trend. It becomes a touchstone in conversations about systemic prejudice, working-class struggle, and the quiet strength of Black motherhood. And though the headlines shift as they always do, she finds herself invited to town halls, school boards, and roundtable discussions with city leaders who now look at her not with pity, but with deference. And at first it feels surreal to be sitting at the same conference tables that once felt so out of reach. But she reminds herself over and over, this was never about fame, never about revenge. It was about truth, and making sure her story didn't just free her, but opened the door for others. And that door swings wide when she receives an invitation to speak at a televised justice forum hosted by the very same network that aired her case. And she almost declines, not out of fear, but because the wound is still fresh, the memory of that courtroom still echoes in her bones. But after staring at the ceiling for hours while her children sleep beside her, she realizes the platform she's been given is not a spotlight. It's a megaphone, and she owes it to every woman who messaged her, saying you or me to every teenage girl with a part-time job and a full-time dream. So she says yes. And when she arrives at the studio on the day of the taping, dressed in a deep maroon blazer and natural curls cascading proudly past her shoulders, the producers scramble to prep her. But she calmly brushes off the makeup artists and whispers, "Don't hide my tired eyes, they've earned their place," and when the lights come up and the applause fades, Janelle looks into the camera with a steady voice and says, "I didn't come here today to talk about how I was humiliated. I came to remind you that what happened to me happens every day to people you ignore." And she tells them about her friend Dominique, a Black trans woman fired from her job at a call center for wearing braids about Carlos, a Mexican father of 4 deported days after reporting wage theft about Yes, Reynolds, a 68-year-old custodian who still mops floors at midnight because her pension was stolen by a corrupt landlord. And the room grows heavy, not with silence, but with listening, real listening. And the moderator nods with glassy eyes and says, "Thank you for giving us their names," and after the show, airs donations to grassroots legal aid groups spike, and Janelle doesn't celebrate. She organizes building bridges between nonprofits, coordinating local child care networks, helping women navigate court systems that once crushed her. And months later, on a rainy Sunday afternoon, she returns to the neighborhood she grew up in, where boarded-up windows and graffiti still mark the corners of memory. and she walks slowly toward the old brick building that used to house the daycare that fired her, now empty and forgotten. And she stands in front of it for a long while, remembering the smell of formula and bleach, the sound of babies crying in cold cribs, and the way her supervisor's eyes avoided hers every time she reported a safety concern. And then, gently, she lays a folded flyer in the broken mailbox slot. New jobs available at Dignity House Benefits Childcare. Respect, come grow with us. And as she walks away, her heels clicking against the cracked pavement, she knows that some battles are won with rage, others with silence, but the most powerful ones are won by refusing to disappear, by planting something better in the ruins of what tried to destroy you. And when she turns the corner, her phone buzzes again. This time, it's an email from a principal at a local charter school, asking if she'll mentor students who want to build a justice initiative of their own. And Janelle smiles, not because she's surprised, but because she's ready, because what was once a courtroom humiliation has become a national turning point, and what was once just survival has now become legacy. And as dusk settles over the streets she once called home, she doesn't whisper a prayer or make a wish. She simply lifts her chin to the wind and walks forward, fully seen, fully heard, and finally, fully whole. Years pass, and the name Janelle Carter slowly evolves from a viral moment into a chapter in school textbooks, civil rights lectures, and community organizing manuals. Not because she courted history, but because she changed it quietly, steadily, like a tide that carves stone. And now at 40, with silver strands beginning to whisper through her curls and laugh lines deepening around eyes that have seen too much to ever close again, she stands at the grand opening of the second Dignity House location, this one built beside a public library that was once slated for demolition, but now thrives as a family resource center, art space, and early education hub, thanks to the partnerships she forged, the petitions she wrote, the allies she empowered, and as hundreds gather under a tent adorned with purple banners and sunflowers. Janelle doesn't give a speech from a podium. She kneels beside a 6-year-old boy holding his mother's hand, hands him a pair of plastic scissors, and lets him cut the ribbon himself. And when the crowd cheers, she leans down and tells him, "This is your house, too, because it always was." And after the ceremony, she walks through the halls past classrooms filled with laughter, finger paint, building blocks, and books where the main characters look like the kids who read them, past the staff lounge where she makes sure every worker has access to mental health care and paid leave, past the mural wall where a teenage artist painted her face beside Maya Angelou's with the words, "Still I Rise," flowing like wind through their hair, and she ends up in her office, small, sunlit, cluttered with thank you cards, children's drawings, and a single framed photo of Oprah hugging her from behind in that courtroom years ago, both women mid-laugh, eyes shining, and she pauses for a moment. Not out of nostalgia, but out of reverence, because that room, that moment, that humiliation was the storm that shook her loose from silence. And just as she's about to sit down, her phone rings with a number she doesn't recognize, and the voice on the other end is nervous, shaking, a young woman saying, "Miss Carter, I don't know who else to call. My boss threatened to fire me when I asked for time off to see my baby in the hospital. I know they're not supposed to do that, but—" And Janelle interrupts gently. "You don't have to explain, honey. Come see me tomorrow, we'll figure it out together." And she writes the girl's name down on a sticky note and places it beside a growing stack. Because for every battle won, there's another still raging in someone's home. someone's job, someone's heart. And as she watches the sun dip low behind the muraled walls of the center, she built from ashes, she hears Ava's voice now. 15, sharp, passionate, and clear, practicing a speech in the hallway about racial bias and standardized testing for a school competition. And she feels something break open in her chest. Not pain, not pride, but the certainty that she was never just fighting for herself. She was building ground solid enough for the next generation to leap from. And when Ava walks in, holding a folder, face glowing with determination, saying, "Mom, they picked me to speak at the state summit," Janelle opens her arms, pulls her daughter close, and whispers, "Then speak the truth, no matter who's watching. Because that's how change survives, not in flashbulbs or trending tags, but in the breath between words the moment one voice dares to rise and another finds the courage to follow. And as mother and daughter sit side by side, sharing stories, laughter, and dreams, a new seed is planted. And Janelle Carter, once ridiculed for her income, now becomes something more than a name, more than a symbol. She becomes a living testament that dignity cannot be measured in dollars, that justice starts when the unheard are finally given a mic, and that the most powerful revolution of all begins not in the courtroom, but in the quiet decision to never shrink again. It's a spring morning, 5 years later, when the National Museum of African American History and Culture unveils a new permanent exhibit titled Modern Voices of Dignity. And at the center of the installation is a simple wooden bench, the very bench Janelle Carter sat on outside the courthouse the day before. Her taping knees, shaking hands, folded, whispering prayers into her palms before walking into a place that tried to strip her worth, and next to it, in a clear glass case, rests the navy blue blazer she wore on national television, now preserved not as costume but as armor. Beside it a placard that reads, "This garment belonged to Janelle Carter, who turned public humiliation into a catalyst for national change." And across from the display is a video loop showing clips from community rallies, press interviews, her original courtroom footage, and a short interview with Oprah. Her voice soft, as she says, "I saw in her the kind of quiet power that can't be faked." It doesn't ask for permission. It simply refuses to disappear. And on opening day, hundreds line the marble halls of the museum. Not for the politicians attending, not even for the media, but for the woman herself. Janelle, now 48, dignified in a mustard gold shawl, her curls pinned back with silver combs, walking slowly through the exhibit with Ava at her side. Now a junior at Howard University, studying public policy and racial equity, who pauses at the exhibit wall bearing her mother's courtroom photo and says softly, "They tried to shame you, and instead they built your platform." And Janelle smiles not with pride, but with peace, because she's lived long enough to see the long arc bend not by force but by faith and labor and love. And as she walks through the gallery, she's surprised to see an elderly woman in a wheelchair quietly crying in front of the mural, whispering, "Because of you, my daughter didn't quit." And a young man in a security uniform shyly hands her a folded poem. He wrote about rising through eviction, and a trans woman with butterfly earrings and fierce eyes simply says, "Thank you for naming us." And Janelle accepts it all, not as praise but as proof that her voice echoed further than any court ruling, reached deeper than any broadcast. And as the museum tour winds down, she stands outside beneath a sky wide and forgiving, where children run through the grass, and a gospel choir sings softly in the distance, and she closes her eyes and lets the moment settle in her bones, remembering the days she thought survival was the best she could hope for, not knowing she would one day become a blueprint, a balm, a beginning. And that night, back home in South L.A., as the streetlights flicker over the third Dignity house now under construction, she opens her journal and writes a single line. I was never alone. I was just early. And as she sets the pen down and watches Ava lead a Zoom call with organizers in Detroit, she knows the world has turned not fully. Not fast enough, but undeniably. And when Ava glances over and asks, "You tired, Mom?" Janelle laughs, leans back and replies, "I'm not tired. I'm just getting out of the way." Because now the torch burns in younger hands. Fiercer hands. Hands unafraid to challenge, to rebuild, to dream loudly, and somewhere in the distance, a little girl turns on a rerun of a courtroom show and sees a woman stand in silence while the world mocked her, and later finds out that silence shook an empire, and from that silence a revolution bloomed. 20 years later, a girl named Malia, 12 years old, dark-skinned, with thick braids and eyes too bright for the small town that tries to dull her, stands at a classroom podium with trembling hands and reads an essay titled "The Woman Who Changed My Mother's Life." And though half her classmates fidget and roll their eyes, the teacher leans in listening as the words spill out in a voice still learning its power. Her name was Janelle Carter, and she was told she didn't belong. But she stayed. She spoke. And because she did, my mom got to keep her job when the manager said she couldn't breastfeed. And I got to go to a preschool where they taught me my skin is not a problem. And in the back of the classroom, a single mother wipes her cheek with her sleeve because she never told her daughter about the eviction notice they avoided after getting legal help from Dignity House, or how the food pantry next door kept their fridge full that first hard winter. And now standing in the doorway, she watches her daughter speak the name Janelle Carter, like scripture, like inheritance, and in that moment across 1,000 cities and small towns, across counties and courtrooms and campuses, other names begin to rise. Children named Janelle Centers, named Dignity Scholarships bearing her story, and a future unfolding with the shape of her fight pressed into its bones. And somewhere far from cameras and stages, the real Janelle, now in her 60s, walks slowly through a community garden she helped build behind the first Dignity House. Her knees aching, but her hands still strong, gently lifting a tomato vine and whispering, "You came back this year," and the volunteer beside her, a young boy with a stutter who barely spoke when he first arrived, smiles and says, "They always do," and they both laugh. Not at the joke, but at the way it carries something more, something unspoken and holy. And that night, as dusk settles over the city that once looked through her, Janelle sits on her porch, wrapped in a soft shawl, sipping tea, while Ava, now a congresswoman, calls from D.C. to read a speech she's writing about working mothers and federal protections. And Janelle listens with eyes closed, tears sliding down like rain against a window. Because the fight is still long, but it's no longer lonely. And when the call ends and the porch light flickers on, she turns to the stars and says a prayer, not for herself, but for every girl still waiting to be seen, every mother still whispering, "Hold on in the dark," and every judge who one day will remember her name and hesitate before speaking down. Because Janelle Carter didn't just change a courtroom or a city or a law. She changed the rhythm of how dignity walks through this world, not with noise but with presence, not with anger but with unshakable truth. And in that truth she will never vanish because women like her never die. they bloom in the places where silence used to live. Long after her hands no longer tend the garden, and her name fades from the headlines, Janelle Carter lives on in ways no statue or textbook could hold in morning rituals, and whispered lessons passed between mothers and daughters in laundromats, in after-school programs, where children recite her story the way others speak of Harriet or Rosa, and in a mural stretching 5 stories tall in downtown Atlanta, where her face looks toward the horizon with sunlight exploding behind her. Beneath it, the words, "She didn't rise alone. She lifted all of us with her," and school buses slow down, just to let the children look, their faces pressed to the windows. Some of them poor, some of them hungry, but none of them invisible anymore, because they've heard the story of the woman who stood silent before a powerful judge, and in that silence built a thunder loud enough to shake the system, and in a future they never thought would arrive. Young women in law school write theses, comparing courtroom theatrics with racial bias, citing the Carter effect as a cultural phenomenon. How one televised moment exposed a country's casual cruelty and lit a fire under millions, and professors speak of her as a modern oracle, someone who carried the pain of generations and turned it into curriculum. And in the halls of Capitol Hill, her daughter Ava introduces the Dignity Act, a sweeping bill that redefines workplace rights for caregivers, mothers, and hourly workers, and when it passes with bipartisan support, the chamber erupts not in applause but in stillness. As Ava stands at the podium, voice trembling, and says, "This bill is for my mother who never had these protections but gave them to me anyway." And somewhere beneath the golden sky of South Los Angeles, in a quiet corner of Dignity House, now turned national headquarters, a candle burns beside Janelle's old journal opened to the last entry she ever wrote, just days before passing peacefully in her sleep at 87, her body weary, but her spirit still moving like river light through everyone she touched. And the entry simply reads, "If one child feels less ashamed because I spoke then, everything was worth it." And in that light, her story becomes a seed ritual song, a lullaby for those who are still learning how to be seen in a world that wants them small. And decades later, when the country commemorates what they now call Dignity Day every April 9th, the day she stood silent but unshaken in that courtroom, schools dim their lights at noon, and for 60 seconds students stand in silence, not as punishment, but as remembrance, as power, because they've been taught that sometimes the loudest revolution is the refusal to disappear. And on that day, across cities and fields and kitchens and street corners, the silence blooms like a flower, and somewhere a little girl, dark-skinned, barefoot, dreaming, whispers to herself, "If she could do it, so can I." And in that whisper, Janelle Carter rises again. Centuries pass, and the name Janelle Carter is no longer bound to the years she walked this earth, but etched into the marrow of a nation that once tried to forget women like her, and now remembers her like gospel, like wind that shapes mountains slowly but forever. And in the archives of a future university, floating in orbit above, a scorched and recovering Earth students study holographic recreations of pivotal human moments. And one lesson begins in a simulated courtroom, the 2020s. The era of performative justice and media trials, and the simulation pauses. Right at the moment, Janelle looks up at Judge Judy, not saying a word, and the professor, an AI-augmented descendant of a long line of educators who once taught from broken classrooms and chalk-dusted boards, tells the class, "What you see here is not silence, it's resistance." And a student barely 20, skin like deep onyx and hair wrapped in gold thread, raises her hand and asks, "But why didn't she fight back out loud?" And the professor smiles and plays the next sequence. Oprah entering the courtroom like a storm wrapped in light and says, "Because some revolutions begin with endurance." And as the class continues, they explore the Carter Doctrine, a social blueprint encoded into planetary policy centuries ago, foundational to the way dignity is legislated now across sectors and settlements, and in the Hall of Human Endurance built on reclaimed land in the new capital of Earth. A towering glass obelisk glows softly with the names of those who altered the course of justice not through war, but through truth, and at its center is Janelle Carter's full name. Not as victim, not even as icon, but as origin. Because her story birthed stories, and those stories became frameworks, and those frameworks became justice not defined by power, but by proximity. Proximity to struggle to care, to the small, unnoticed labors that hold up entire civilizations. And on the anniversary of her silent stand, now known as Global Dignity Day, billions participate not by marching, but by pausing. Work ceases, schools fall silent. People look one another in the eyes and ask, "Are you being seen?" And in refugee camps turned thriving green cities, in moon settlements built by once marginalized communities in the ancestral archives of every major system on Earth, her voice calm, unwavering, tender still plays. "I didn't come to win, I came to be seen. And in being seen I became more than one woman. I became us." And deep in a museum, buried beneath the restored ruins of a long-forgotten data center, an original clip, grainy, fragile, ancient, still plays from an old court show, where a black mother stands with nothing but truth in her posture, and a world built on forgetting begins to remember again and again. Because Janelle Carter is no longer just history. She is the very memory of justice, learning how to love, how to wait, how to rise, in a future where the earth no longer spins as fast, and cities float in the air like prayers kept aloft by invention, in a world where skin glows with ancestral code and language hums from lips that have never touched the old world's air. A child kneels at a glowing pool of water inside the Temple of Voices, where pilgrims come not to worship but to remember, and she speaks her question into the pool, a question all children are allowed to ask only once. What is dignity? And the water ripples, then stills, then shimmers with an ancient recording, the only surviving clip from a lost civilization corrupted, flickering but still burning. A woman standing alone in a courtroom, her silence louder than war, her stillness a storm held tight inside skin that had been told to shrink. And though the names are lost, the essence remains, and the child watches eyes wide, as the image shifts from courtroom to garden, from garden to mural, from mural to stars, where the same woman's eyes now stretch across constellations named not after conquerors, but caregivers, teachers, nurses, mothers, and the voice in the pool, a fusion of data and soul, speaks not in words, but in vibration, and the child feels it in her bones. Dignity is standing when the world expects you to kneel. Dignity is naming your worth before anyone else does. Dignity is planting something that grows long after you're gone. And, as the image fades and the water returns to stillness, the child rises blinking and returns to the others where they sit under the branches of the Tree of Echoes, where every leaf carries a story from before the forgetting. And she shares what she saw, not just a woman, but a beginning, not just a courtroom, but a forge. Not just injustice, but the seed of a world that learned how to heal. And though no one speaks her name anymore, not because it is erased, but because it has become everything, they still follow her path in how they treat the worker, how they honor the mother, how they speak to the child who trembles. And each time a system begins to forget again, the pool glows, and a child kneels, and Janelle Carter rises once more, not as a ghost, but as a rhythm, eternal, quiet, unbreakable, the way gravity is, the way truth always was, far beyond the limits of planets and cities and systems in a spacecraft sanctuary, drifting between galaxies on a pilgrimage of memory and mercy. The Order of the Quiet Flame gathers for their centennial rite hooded figures, diverse in form and blood, all descendants of the displaced, the discarded, the unseen, and before them glows the last surviving archive of origin mothers, their identities fractured across wars, floods, and firewalls, and yet one figure always returns, always reforms, not with fanfare, but with focus, not through fame, but through feeling a woman whose silence once rerouted a culture, a stillness now studied by kinetic theologians who map resistance through motionless defiance. And at the center of the chamber, carved into obsidian stone, is a single phrase burned by laser and reverence. Both she stood, and so we built, and though her face has long blurred into abstraction, depicted now as neither race nor shape, but as a convergence of light and firmness, her impact pulses through the gravity of how justice is defined aboard every station in this quadrant of space. No leader is allowed to speak without first listening. No trial may begin without the story of the stand being recited in breathless unity. And no child enters their name into the galactic census without first placing their hand upon the dignity seal, a simple indentation that matches no one's fingers perfectly, because it belongs to all of them, and when the youngest among them asks, "Was she ever real?" the eldest smile not with certainty, but with devotion, because reality is not what endures, it's what transforms. And Janelle Carter once mocked for her bank balance, once told she was less than worthy, now exists in algorithms used to train empathy-based governance, in the muscle memory of every generation taught that power without tenderness is no power at all. And as the spacecraft passes through a nebula shaped by time and starlight, the Order sings a song made of no words, only pulses 4 beats. Then stillness, an echo of a heart that once broke open the world not with fire, not with armies, but with truth that refused to shrink, and in that silence across space, across centuries, across names, she rises again, not to be seen, but to remind them that they were never invisible. In the farthest reaches of existence, past the collapse and rebirth of stars in the archive of broken beginnings, a living planet where only the most sacred stories are allowed to root there, exists a single tree that hums not with leaves but with names, and its trunk dark as deep water, and etched with pulses of golden memory bears no branches except one, a curved arc of living data that glows with her initials, J.C., not carved, but grown, because the planet remembers her not as a woman, not even as a myth, but as a law of emotional gravity, a constant that recalibrated the moral center of humanity when it teetered on cruelty, and every 1,000 years, when a new civilization enters the fold. They send their finest empath, cloaked in silence, to sit before the tree, and place one hand upon its bark. And in return, they receive a single memory, a feeling, a truth, a moment encoded in Janelle Carter's life, and though they do not understand the language, they feel it, and it changes them always as it did. The first for the tree does not tell the story in words or sound, but in sensation. The hot shame of being ridiculed in public. The deep humming strength of standing anyway. The shiver of injustice ignored, and the flame of dignity that rises anyway. And as these beings, some light, some silicon, some bone, weep without knowing why, the archive blooms again, whispering across time. You were never meant to bow. And so they rise, these new creatures, these future hearts, and they build their systems differently, weaving care into their algorithms, weaving softness into their armor. And though no one remembers the shape of Janelle's hands, all know what it feels like to be held by her defiance. Her silence, her rise, because it was never just one courtroom, never just one moment. It was the fracture that let the light in, the axis of awakening, and long after Earth has crumbled into myth and language has reshaped itself into scent and rhythm. The pulse of her resistance continues to ripple unchanged, because the truth is this: Janelle Carter never wanted a legacy. She just wanted a place where no child would ever again need to prove their worth to be protected. And in that wanting, she gave the universe its spine, and so, from a single mother's silence in a courtroom, once meant to shame her to galaxies shaped by the dignity she refused to surrender. The legacy of Janelle Carter reminds us all. Justice does not begin in power, but in presence. Dignity is not something we earn. It is something we claim. Her story did not end in that courtroom. It began there, and now it lives in all of us. Every time we speak up, every time we refuse to shrink, every time we choose compassion over control, Janelle Carter did not stand alone. She stood first, and because she did, we all learned how to rise. If stories like this move you, if you believe truth still matters, and justice still lives in the voices of the unheard, subscribe now. Turn on notifications so you never miss the next powerful journey. Join a growing community that honors courage, uplifts the silenced, and believes storytelling can change the world. Because here, every voice counts and every click is a stand.